everyone. You are listening to Evidence for Faith. This is the Christian Apologetics radio show that helps Christians become thinkers and thinkers become Christians. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Mike Larakis, and with me today is author Kirk Hastings. Hello, Kirk.
Hi, Mike.
Glad to have you back again.
Thank you.
Kirk has been pinch hitting for Keith, or if I'm out, he'll pinch hit for me. We have him on the show on a regular basis because he is an accomplished author. He wrote a book about 2 years ago now, Kirk?
About 2 years
2
now.
years ago, and it's entitled What is Truth?
Yep.
Famous quote by Pontius Pilate himself, and
Yep.
Kirk does a nice job as an introductory level apologetics book, which takes into consideration many of the topics that we talk about on this show. So, Kirk, I'd like to welcome you again. We got a terrific show lined up today. We're going to talk about evolution, and we're going to talk strictly about the facts that support or don't support evolution. We're going to try to frame this in the context of being evidentialists as opposed to creationists or materialists or secular humanists. We're going to try to frame this in the context of science alone and see where the scientific evidence takes us. And if you can think about anything, folks, and I'm talking to you, the listening audience right now, if you can think of anything that would support the argument of evolution above that of, let's say, an intelligent design concept, we'd like you to call us and give us your thoughts. You can call us at 398-1020. And we'll be happy to field your call and see if we can answer your question and try to frame this in the context of science only. This is not a religious discussion. This is going to be a scientific endeavor. I would like everyone to know right off the bat before we get started is that this program is being supported in part by Grace Community Church in Winslow Township, Waterford Works. You can visit their website, check it out, aplaceforgrace.org. That's a place for the number 4grace.org. Likewise, our website can be accessed. It's called Evidence for the number 4 Faith, evidenceforfaith.com, and you can listen to any of our previous radio shows that you may have missed in the past. And towards the end of this program, I'm going to suggest a few of the shows that we've done in the past that specifically deal with the sciences, with specifically a debate that we had with a Stockton University professor and also a geneticist that was interviewed about a year ago. So we will suggest some resources towards the end of our discussion, or we might bring them up as time allows us while we're going through this body of work and this body of evidence. So, Kirk, if I had to ask you who was your favorite author along these lines, along the lines of, let's say, intelligent design, who would you say that would be beside yourself?
Beside myself, okay. I would have to say definitely a man named Philip Johnson, who wrote a book a few years ago called Darwin on Trial.
Correct. I believe it was 1992 that was published.
He's written 3 or 4 books since then, but that was his first major publication.
Right, and a little bit of background on Philip Johnson. He is a law professor at the University of Berkeley in California, and he's actually written a number of books. He's written not only Darwin on Trial, which is his most famous work, but he also wrote Reason in the Balance and Defeating Darwinism, not Defending Darwinism, Defeating Darwinism.
Right.
And he makes some pretty sound arguments that would make Darwin probably roll over in his grave. Now, everyone realized that Charles Darwin did promote his theories in 1859, so it's almost 151 years ago that his work, The Origin of the Species, was written. And in all fairness to Charles Darwin, when he wrote that work, he did not try to explain in a scientific fashion how it is that life came into being. Okay, what he tried to do was show in his Tree of Life a materialistic way to explain why it is that species would come into existence and then go on to evolve into a more complicated organism or animal, if you will. So
yes, it's interesting that the title of his book is The Origin of Species, but he really doesn't deal with the specific idea of where the species came from in his book.
that is correct.
He deals with how they changed through time.
That's correct.
But not where they originally came from.
Right. Now, in all fairness to Charles Darwin, he was not a geneticist. In fact, genetics was in its most basic form at that point in time. In fact, it was 20 or so years earlier that Mendel was actually doing his experiments with peas and so forth. The Mendelian experiments are something that we learned about in high school science, and that had to do with, blue eyes, brown hair, and that sort of thing. Where you have the double B for brown eyes in capitals, and then the two small b's for blue eyes, and then you get the various crisscrossing and genetic traits of the offspring. I think that we all remember those types of problems that we dealt with in high school.
Oh yeah, I have nightmares about that.
Genetics has evolved in a tremendous fashion since that time with the mapping of the human genome almost six years ago.
Right.
And just a whole lot of things that...
and microbiology has come a long way in the last 20, 30 years.
Correct. And what we're trying to do is lay some background, folks, of this genetics argument with Watson and Crick being the co-discoverers of DNA and the double helical design. But even still, the amount of genetics knowledge over the last 60 years has exploded, and the complexity of that molecule itself is just incredible. And to think that happened with time and chance and random events during the course of the world's history or the galaxy's history or the universe's history is just mind-boggling. To think that all of this could have started in a primordial soup. And then
I might also mention too that the sciences of like archaeology and paleoanthropology and all that were all in their infancy too when Darwin wrote his book.
Correct.
The fossil record, there really wasn't much around at that point.
Right. Although he did know about the Cambrian explosion, and he knew that there were some inherent pitfalls that might actually cause his theory to be in crisis. And
he actually admits in quite a few places in his book that the possibility that he might be wrong about this or he might be wrong about that. He really is not. I wouldn't call him totally dogmatic or anything. He really, in his span of life, he kind of understood, I think, that what he was coming up with was a fairly new idea, and there were possibilities that at least parts of it could be disproven in the future. But unfortunately, many scientists today are not that open-minded. They've decided this is the way it is. It can't ever be any other way. I don't care what the evidence, that we discover in the future is. This is how it must be.
Right. And
we don't necessarily see that attitude in Darwin himself.
Well, we're talking about a philosophy there, and we will get into that because that is actually shaping the way science is performed in the laboratory and in the publications.
Right.
And that has to do with materialism and philosophical naturalism, which is what the religion, if you will, of secular humanism is. And this is what's being taught to our children in school.
Right.
But anyway, looking at Darwin himself, it's interesting. If you read Philip Johnson's works, he will say that there were four major thought leaders in the 20th century, that really shaped the way the university and the academic institutions would teach the next generation and the ongoing future generations. And they were Darwin, and then there was Nietzsche, the philosopher, and then there was Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Now, during the course of this past century, and I'm quoting him now, he says that Darwin actually supplied the murder weapon, and we're talking about the murder weapon for God as the intelligent designer.
Right.
Nietzsche actually made the pronouncement that God was dead.
You mean Time magazine didn't start that?
No. And Karl Marx, we know that he has the economic theory.
And the political and social thought.
Right, that has driven...
implications of God not existing.
Right, and of course that would drive a lot of the societal norms, especially in Europe, even now in a postmodern Europe.
Yep.
The principles of Marxism are firmly entrenched there and trying to sneak into this country. And then finally,
I don't think they're sneaking in. I think they're barging the door down.
Okay, well, I'm trying to be a little gentle, Kirk.
Okay,
but I'm not going to argue with you. In fact, Philip Johnson will tell you that there are basically three strongholds of Marxism in this country, and that would be in Cambridge, Massachusetts, of course, with Harvard being one of the thought leaders there. Berkeley, California, which is where he's a law professor, so he knows.
Yeah.
And would it surprise you if I told you that Duke University and the Research Triangle in North Carolina had the most socialists registered to vote?
Yeah, actually it would. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, that's actually been printed. I've read that.
I've heard of Berserkly many times, though.
Berserkly?
That's what they
California?
call it now.
Okay. But anyway, he talks about why it is that this Darwinian theory would be in crisis. Now, Kirk, give me a little insight. Why do you think that Darwinian thought, the theory of evolution, and natural selection would be in crisis now? Is there a major conflict between what science is telling us, what it's showing us, and what the philosophical naturalists are trying to espouse?
I think there is. I think there's a broad gap between the two.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I don't think it's a necessary gap myself, but of course I'm sure many scientists and people would disagree with that, but yeah, there's a gap that seems to be getting wider and wider all the time. On the one side, if I can put this in somewhat modern terms, on the one side there is the idea of intelligent design, that everything that we see was created by an intelligence of some kind, which of course, Christians and people that believe in the Bible say it's the God of the Bible. And the other side that says that everything came about by random chance, that there is no intelligence behind it. It simply took a mix of things that came together over millions and billions of years, and we simply got all the different random things that we have today. And there really is no way to reconcile those two views. You either have an intelligence behind everything or a lack of intelligence behind everything, and there's no middle ground.
All right, so there's either random chance happenings with material and time and laws,
which is called naturalism, or
correct.
materialism by science today.
Or materialistic naturalism.
Right.
And this is actually what's proposed by the secular humanists in today's university setting.
And really, I don't know how many people realize that secular humanism, if they've never heard that term before, that is actually was judged a few years ago by the Supreme Court that it is a system of religious thought,
Correct.
Which is based on the idea that God does not exist.
Right.
In other words, it's based on atheism. And that naturalism and materialism is the scientific outgrowth of that belief.
Yeah, let's tease that apart a little bit right now. Let's give a pure definition of science, okay?
Okay.
And then
That's a good place to start.
And then we're going to talk about the naturalists, the materialists' definition of science. But let's start with the pure definition of science.
Okay.
And this is, according to Philip Johnson, by the way, and of course I think that it would be a fair statement that most academics would agree with this statement. Science is based upon impartial, factual, repeatable investigations and observations that is fair and open to free deliberation of all ideas and follows the evidence where it leads. And it's also reproducible in other scientific laboratories and settings so that it can be confirmed and basically put forth as irrefutable. Okay?
I remember being taught in elementary school that science is observation, something that can be experimented on, and something that is repeatable. Those are the three qualities of science.
That's correct. Okay, now the problem that we get into with this materialism and naturalism and secular humanism, they've actually redesigned the scientific definition of sorts.
Okay.
And basically they're saying that the science is devoted as a principle of reason to a prejudice that's already inherent to materialism, because It starts with the laws and particles of nature that are in motion, and then chance, and then law-driven behavior. So that with chance and time plus natural law, these substitute now for a designer, and consequently you don't have something that's necessarily showing you what it should be. We have a problem with the definition of pure science in that it's already prejudicial. In other words, they're trying to hammer home a square peg into a round hole because they already have a prejudice with respect to where the evidence would lead, and that would be intelligent design.
Their prejudice, of course, is that only things that are material, that's the only things that exist are material things. There is nothing beyond that.
Correct.
And we're not ready to even consider any evidence to the contrary.
Right. So there is a basic problem with the way their scientific data is presented and interpreted. Now, likewise, they could make the same claims for you and me, that we're looking through it through the lens of people who believe in creationism. But I'm gonna state emphatically today that we're going to be talking about evidential stuff instead of creationist stuff. We're just going to look at the evidence, the hard science behind what we're going to talk about, not necessarily something out of the Bible or some other...
Not using religious ideas, but scientific ideas.
Right.
And really, in my book, What is Truth, that's the basis upon which I build the progression in my book, is I kind of reiterate the way that I came to believe in an intelligent designer, in that I grew up with no religion. I wasn't taught any religion by my parents or whatever, never went to church, and really didn't have any basis or bias one way or the other as to whether any religions were true or none of them were true or whatever. And I decided that I really wanted to know, what does the evidence tell us about these kinds of things? You know, is it really true that we came about by accident over millions of billions of years, or did God create things, or is it like part of one and part of the other? Or I really was pretty much open to finding whatever reason would bring me to. And the interesting thing is that my search in that direction, and really I started out not paying much attention to what religion said, but what science showed me. And I came to the conclusion that the Bible was right, that there is an intelligent designer.
Okay. So the real question of the day, and we're going to try to answer this question, is, can non-living chemicals spontaneously combine to form a complex living organ or organism?
Right.
If you feel strongly one way or the other, folks, we'd like to hear from you. You can call us at 398-1020. Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
I'm Kirk Hastings,
and it's good
guest host for the week.
Good to have you folks listening on this Sunday afternoon. Now, if I were a university student, Kirk, and I asked a university biology professor that question, can non-living chemicals really spontaneously combine to form a complex living organ or organism? He would look at me dumbfounded and say, Of course. Yes. That's a dumb question.
Yeah.
Of course. That's a given.
Right.
But I remember in high school I learned about something called spontaneous generation. Okay, and that was disproven in the 1830s. It's my understanding that we do have a caller on the line. Hello, caller. Identify yourself. Hello? No, we must have lost them. They might call back 398-1020. But anyway, if I were to ask that question in a university setting, I would probably be ostracized because there's no room for any other option. Yes, of course, it's a stupid question. You can't assume that anything else happened. How do we know that? We're here. The flowers are here. The trees are here. The animals are here. You and I are sitting here. But yet,
in other words, existence proves itself.
But when I look around this studio and I'm thinking to myself, okay, we're getting these thoughts and ideas out to millions of people, and I see a couple of computers sitting in front of our sound engineer, Tom, and I see a tremendously complex headset sitting on your head, and a big microphone sticking in your mouth, and all of this gadgetry that was clearly designed for a purpose. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I understand our caller is back. Hello, caller. Identify yourself.
How you doing?
Good.
I think the question is a lot of times is not so much whether there is a God or there's not a God, or whether we got here by Adam and Eve or we got here by evolution. I think sometimes it's a matter of the characteristic of God himself. In the light that your top religious leaders, such as Billy Graham, I guess there's a few others, their main theme, as I have listened to them in the past, is that God is a God of love. I think you'll agree with that.
Indeed.
Now, if you connect that with what we've seen just in the last week or two, here we've had 29 workers killed just by going to their job. They were killed inside of a mine. And then we had 11 more killed a couple of days ago out in the ocean just going to their job, drilling oil. That's 40. And then yesterday we had 10 killed in their home just by being home. That's 50 killed. So I guess the question a lot of people would throw out is not so much whether he exists or not, but if he's a God of love, why would he stand by and let these horrible things happen to people?
Okay, that's a great question, and we've heard this question many times before. Actually,
that's a basic question that many people have.
We have actually dedicated one whole show to this pressing question, and what I would suggest is that you go to our website. It's Evidence for Faith. That's the number 4, evidence, the number 4 faith.com, and just scroll down through the 70 or so titles that you'll see. And the title of that one is, Why Is It That Bad Things Happen to Good People If There Is a Loving God? And, unfortunately, many of these things have to do with choices that people make and other factors that are way beyond our control. But from a biblical perspective, you have to remember that the Prince of the Air is ruling at the ground level. Okay, our discussion today has to do with the science behind evolution and really whether or not there's an intelligent designer behind that. But thank you for your question.
That's really, like you said, that's a whole other show in itself, answering that question that he just asked. Probably more than one show.
So, but anyway, getting back to the topic at hand, Kirk, you mentioned to me earlier that if you had to look at scientific evidences behind intelligent design, or at least a scientific evidence that would refute evolution, let's say from a primordial soup point of view, we talked about spontaneous generation a little bit, and Pasteur was the one that proved that there was no such thing as spontaneous generation. And I think that most scientists will adhere to that, and this goes back to the 1830s. So it's very hard for anybody to argue that we came from the primordial soup. One of the arguments that I give along those lines, too, is if you took 10 frogs and put them in a Waring blender and blenderized the whole mess and you created your own primordial soup, you'd have all the ingredients necessary with all the genetics, the eyeballs, the kidneys, the bladder, the intestines, the brain, and so forth. And if you let it sit there for 10 million years, what would you have?
You'd still have a gooey mess.
No, it would probably be a dry dust. But even if you put it in a controlled environment at, let's say, 80 degrees or 85 degrees, whatever the optimal temperature is to incubate that mess, and put preservatives in the soup so that it didn't decay, would in fact 10 million years later, would you have frogs jumping out of the blender?
I highly doubt it.
Probably not. So something.
I've also heard a good example that when you take a person, if you walk into a funeral home and you look at a person who has recently died, when you're looking at that person, everything that is necessary for life is there in that person, but they're no longer alive. So having the ingredients for life in and of itself is not enough to generate life. There's something else besides just having the ingredients.
Yeah, in the early 50s, 1953, I'm surprised nobody's called in about this, the Mueller experiment occurred, and it created a lot of sensational news in 53 and 54, where they took the basic ingredients of molecules in life, some methane, some carbon, some oxygen, and so forth.
The chemicals that they believe existed in the primordial earth.
Exactly, and they sparked electrical current across these gases and so forth, and they came up with some rudimentary chemicals that really did not last that long in the laboratory, despite the fact that they were trying to control the environment within the glass flask itself.
Right.
So they felt that this was enough evidence to show that complex molecules could be formed in a laboratory setting.
Right.
Now that
But there are two rational problems with that experiment. Number one is they've since found that the chemicals that they thought existed in the early Earth are not what they thought they were when they did that experiment. So that in itself causes that experiment to not work anymore. And the other ingredient is, when you think about it, this was an intelligent scientist who was doing this experiment and putting all these ingredients together and creating the conditions under which this happened.
Are you saying that he was an intelligent designer?
I'm saying that this experiment was more of an example of an intelligent designer causing this to happen rather than the opposite.
Okay,
you had a thinking person behind all of this,
your point
or it wouldn't have happened on its own.
Your point is very well taken, and I agree with that.
And at the time, no one recognized that
right
contradiction.
Now, Kirk, if we took that same experiment and said that it was a robust success on the part of science, okay, and said that, okay, we have been able to recreate in a laboratory setting complex chemical matter out of nothing, just with a spark, okay, and the ingredients. There are a couple of things that don't allow these things to stay together very long. I mean, there are a lot of factors that go into it, but specifically, I'm looking for the second law of thermodynamics. Can you tell me what that's all about?
Well, actually, you have kind of the first and second laws of thermodynamics operating here. The one which says that neither matter or energy can be created or destroyed.
Right. It's constant. The amount of energy and matter in the universe remains constant.
It can change from one to the other, but the total amount stays the same.
Correct.
And the other one is that all energy in the universe is in the process of winding down or cooling off.
Okay, this is the concept of entropy, and this is the second law of thermodynamics, saying that it's going from a state of higher order to a state of lesser order or decay. We can
or
use
chaos.
The word decay, right, leading towards chaos, exactly.
Yet evolution would have us believe the opposite, that we started with chaos and we're ending up with
order.
Order.
Right. Okay, so what you're saying is that evolutionary theory flies in the face of the second law of thermodynamics.
Yes.
Okay.
What is the first and second law?
Right.
Really, when you get down to it.
What's the difference between a law and a theory? Can you tell me that?
Yes, a theory is an idea that hasn't been scientifically proven.
Correct.
A law is something that has been scientifically observed and experimented on over and over and over again, and we always come up with the same result.
Okay, right.
There's never been an exception to this, in other words.
A law is considered universal fact no matter where you are in the universe.
Right.
Okay, whereas a theory is yet to be proven. And Darwin's theory of evolution is being taught as fact in school, not as a theory. So,
by many people, yes, unfortunately.
So this is a point that I'm happy to make, and people have to realize that Darwinian theory and the theory of evolution is really the only thing that secular humanists have to rely on, because they have no other explanation as to how life got here in the first place. Even if
in a kind of weird way, it kind of makes sense if you do automatically cut God out of the equation, or an intelligent designer. Then what you're left with is this idea of evolution. That's the only other reasonable course for you to take. The problem is, as we've already mentioned, there's an inherent bias in this, in that you're cutting God out of the equation to begin with, before you check the evidence out to see whether, does the evidence show that there could have been a God or an intelligent designer involved in this or not.
Right.
You're assuming that there isn't.
Correct. What the assumption is here is that evolutionary processes are mindless. It has everything to do with chance, the chance of one particle coming into contact with another. the laws of the universe, time, and I should say lots of time, because typically you hear the term millions or billions of years.
Lots of time.
Okay, and because of this time that's allotted to the theory, that the scientists are able to explain away any probability that the mathematicians might throw at them and say, well, you know, mathematically that's impossible or highly improbable. But then they'll say, well, with millions of years, it can happen. Okay, and that's how they exclude the mathematical probabilities of these things happening. You know, Richard Dawkins, who is the arch enemy of anybody who would espouse intelligent design, he states that biology is the study of complex things which look as if they were designed for a purpose. Okay?
It's interesting that he would concede that.
That's an interesting statement. Tell me what you mean by concede that point.
That even he's making, suggesting the idea, well, this stuff looks designed.
Why?
So how do you know that it isn't designed?
Well, I think he's actually nervous because there are a lot of scientists who are jumping on the bandwagon of intelligent design because they realize that there are so many flaws inherent to Darwin's theory of evolution.
That's possible.
And that...
He's kind of leaving a crack in the door for them.
Right. So, but, you know, Darwinism is the only plausible alternative to the materialists, the naturalists, the secular humanists. They have nothing else to hang their hat on because they're admitted atheists.
And really, I think they're giving long spans of time a little too much credit. They're really saying if you have enough time, anything is possible. Actually, they are saying that. They've said that in so many words. And yet, how that in itself, to me, is not a scientific statement. How can you prove that? Right. How can you prove that anything, given enough time, will come about on its own?
Right.
And the answer is you can't. There's never been an experiment or anything that's ever shown that that can happen. That's more a philosophical statement than a scientific statement. And what I think a lot of people don't understand today is a lot of things that scientists say today are not scientific. Just because they're a scientist doesn't mean that everything they say is scientific. They can state things that are philosophical in nature or imaginative or speculative or whatever, just the same as anyone else. We need to be able to separate their opinions from their scientific statements, which are not always the same thing.
And here is the question, Kirk, that you can actually push somebody against the wall when they're making a philosophical argument as opposed to a scientific argument. You can ask them, is the evidence of science pointing us to intelligent design or Darwinian evolution? Okay? Now, when you and I look at the evidence as evidentialists, we see the thumbprint of God all over it. You know, especially when you look at the complexity of the DNA molecule. Okay? And I've always said that the Human Genome Project, when it was completed in, 6 years ago, it has the thumbprint of God on it, all over it, because the human genome is so complex, and what it creates is just incredibly complex. And remember, every ounce of that genetic material resides in every cell, and more importantly, it resides in the germ cells. The germ cells are the future progeny. Okay, the germ cells are the actual DNA that are left when you were conceived in your mother's womb. A certain amount of that DNA was sent to the germ cells. That is the future sperm cells that you would actually produce when you became a man. Okay. Likewise, in the living female, her germ cells were already allocated with the genetic material. So the problems with Darwinian evolution are compounded by the fact that the germ cells themselves would actually have to mutate, okay, in advance of any outside force trying to direct them in a way that Darwin and his proponents espouse. And that's actually impossible because they're the forces of evolution. And by the way, folks, we really have to make a distinction here between microevolution and macroevolution. Okay? Kirk and I
That's an important point.
both believe that microevolution happens, okay?
Right.
This is the peppered moth experiment. This is the finch beak experiment that Darwin observed very elegantly on the Galapagos Islands in his original work.
In other words, living things have the ability within a certain set of parameters to adapt to their environments.
That is
That
correct.
happens all the time.
Right, and we call that microevolution.
Right.
Macroevolution, on the other hand, is leaping to a completely different organism or animal. Okay.
In other words, saying that a new species can arise from an existing species.
Correct.
That's completely different from the original.
That's right.
That's a totally different idea than, for instance, a germ being able to generate a defense against
penicillin,
yes,
so to speak.
a medicine that's, that we use to fight it. Sometimes a germ or a virus or whatever can mutate a defense against that, but that's not the same thing. It's still a virus. It doesn't change into something completely different. Whereas scientists today are saying a rock, given enough time, can turn into a human being.
Well, I'd like to back up the ship a little bit since I'm a doc, and I want to make a comment about germs that are resistant to penicillin.
Uh-huh.
It's because the germ has lost genetic information that allows it to be susceptible to the penicillin.
Okay.
Okay.
That's a good way of putting it.
Now, here's what happened, though. A loss of genetic information occurred. That was the mutation that allowed the germ to be resistant to the penicillin.
Right.
So the problem
It's
here...
not something that it gains that makes it not susceptible. It's something that it's losing.
That's correct. And all mutations, and here's the other thing that speaks so powerfully against the Darwinistic theory, all mutations are a loss of genetic information.
Right.
There's no new information that's generated, okay?
Right.
And from a physician's perspective, when I see a mutation in real life,
Mm-hmm.
I see disease, death, and deformity. Those are the
That's
three
why
options.
almost all examples of this are, how should I put it, detrimental.
That is correct.
Almost all mutations are in a worse state than they were before.
Right, and I'm frequently reminded of the G6PD deficiency that allows for the sickle cell anemia people in Africa to be more hardy against malaria.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument there, and I throw this right back at them, I say, you know what? Sickle cell anemia is a bad disease. It causes bone infarcts. It causes spleen problems, blood problems.
Mm-hmm.
People die from sickle cell anemia. This is not a good mutation, okay?
No, it causes the breakdown of bodily systems, which is not a good thing.
It does. And
at least not from our point of view, it is.
Correct. And I don't believe that it has anything to do with survival of African people and makes them more resistant to malaria.
Right.
But this is a constant thing that's thrown up as an argument for a good beneficial mutation.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, you are listening to Evidence for Faith. Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis with author Kirk Hastings. Say hi, Kirk.
Hi, Kirk.
And what we're doing, we're talking about Darwinian evolution in the context of real science, the pitfalls, and whether or not it's actually something that holds substance, and whether or not there's an argument out there for intelligent design. Now, Kirk, we had talked about a couple of things already relative to science that would be refuting evolution. We talked about spontaneous generation. We talked about the first and second laws of thermodynamics. I wanted to get a little bit into the law of biogenesis. Okay, I sort of alluded to that when I was talking about germ cells.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the law of biogenesis states that like kind reproduces like kind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? In other words, Kirk Hastings can reproduce another little Kirk Hastings. Okay?
Right.
Or your dog can produce another dog. But it's not going to produce a cat, and it's not going to produce a goldfish.
Right.
Okay, now the germ cells that we all had at the time we were conceived, really this goes back to the time of conception, when the organs were being differentiated, the germ cells went to your future organs of reproduction. Okay.
Now, when you say germ cells, you're not saying like a cold germ. When you say germ, you're referring to a basic.
Correct. Germinal. It would be a germinal form of cell that would produce a certain type of body organ system or whatever. And I'm talking about the germ cells of reproduction.
Right. Just wanted to make sure the audience would understand that.
Right. Not an infectious form of a germ. No. I'm talking about a reproductive cell line.
Basic cells. Yeah.
Now, the interesting concept here, and I think this is a really easy visual for people to get. I think every one of us has gotten one of those wooden doll type things where you open it up. It looks like a gourd really, but let's say it's got a lady that's painted on it with a dress that's very colorful. Mm-hmm. You open it up and then there's a smaller version of her inside of the bigger one.
Right.
And you open that one up and there's yet a smaller one and on down the line. Uh-huh. So if you open them all up, there's like 10 of them going from the biggest one to the littlest one.
Right.
Okay, now any organism that reproduces itself has a similar circumstance in that the entire line of its future progeny are already predetermined with the germline cell for reproduction. Mm-hmm. Okay, now the problem that evolutionary theory has is that outside influences are predictable. I shouldn't say predictable. They're alleged to predict the formation of a new species or a new being. Okay, mm-hmm. But the problem is that it does not have anything to do with the germ line, the cell line that's going to affect the future progeny. Mm-hmm. In other words, whatever adaptation that you and I make, whether it's cold weather, hot weather, being one-legged or whatever it is, or living in chemical pollution in the next 50 years, mm-hmm. no matter what we can do to adapt, it has nothing to do with the germ line of our future progeny, of our future offspring, mm-hmm. because the genetic code is already set in stone, and it reproduces itself one generation after the next.
Right.
So you would actually have to have that individual adapt and adapt and adapt and adapt with each subsequent generation. There's no one adaptation that occurs now that will lead you to the future generations having that adaptive capability.
Right.
You with me on that?
Yes.
Maybe you can explain it a little easier to our listening audience.
The way that I've heard that kind of is, I think what you're trying to get at is that, just to use a wild example, like if I were to live the rest of my life in the Arctic and I got hairier as a result to keep myself warm, I would not, since that is a trait that I developed during my lifetime, that's not a trait I could pass on to my son. He wouldn't be born hairy because adaptive traits are not passed on like that. It would have to be a basic change in my DNA, that would be passed on. But that's an adaptive trait is not a basic change like that can be passed on to children.
Right. Now, getting back to microevolution, what we know now is that these small changes in adaptation that are exhibited by, let's say, the finch and the length of its beak, or the peppered moth, they were variations that were already genetically there, okay, mm-hmm. that were selected for.
They had the capability of those changes in them to begin with.
That is correct.
It's simply their environment that caused them to change to determine which adaptive change that they would take advantage of.
Right. Now,
but it was already there to some extent.
If I can use the example of the Arctic, you have all of the rabbit population up there. They're white. They blend into the environment. Mm-hmm. Okay, but the brown hair of a rabbit is also part of that genetic makeup. Right. But they are selected against because if they're brown on the white tundra, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb, and sure. the predators are going to get them.
And the brown rabbits are going to die out awful quick.
That's correct. So the white rabbits are the ones that reproduce over and over and over again. But the brown hair part is still part of their genetic makeup.
But if you bring some of those white rabbits down into a warm climate over a number of generations, you may start getting brown-haired babies.
That's correct.
Because they don't necessarily need the white hair anymore, and they already have that capability in them of brown hair, so that would start to come out again.
Correct. That's exactly correct.
Right.
So that speaks for the pre-programmed response that allows for that microevolutionary process to happen.
Right.
Okay.
Really, the example I used of my growing long hair in the Arctic isn't really accurate either. You wouldn't be able to do that. But some scientists suggest, like for instance, to take an example, they say that the woolly mammoth, with its long coat that used to exist, that modern elephants are their descendants, and that they don't need the hairy coat anymore. Therefore, they've adapted and did away with it. But really, that really doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. In other words, what happened probably was there was a species without hair and there was one with hair, and the ones with the hair, as the climate got warmer, they died out. So you're left with the ones without hair. One didn't change into the other or go back and forth.
Right.
And there really isn't any evidence from the fossil record or anything else to indicate that one literally changed into the other.
Right.
They assume that because of structural similarities. They say, well, this one probably ended up becoming that one. But it's amazing how many times they use words like might have or could have, or they use speculative words when speaking about evolution, because in effect they really don't know scientifically whether it really did that or not.
Yeah, and a lot of it is speculation.
It is,
and it's
very
based,
much.
It's based on theory and not proof.
It makes a good story and it sounds good, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's scientific.
Well, that's very true. Let's talk a little bit about irreducible complexity, Kirk.
Okay.
Now, I had the privilege of hearing Michael Behe speak back in 1997. It was right after he published his book.
He's kind of the father of irreducible complexity, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
He came up with that.
Yep. He is a
concept.
A biochemist PhD at Lehigh University, so he's actually local. He's local.
Not too far away.
And he took a lot of heat for his book, but he makes a very, very good argument in that if you take something that's very complex, like you and me, any complex living organism, and take one piece of that pie out of it, it ceases to function. Okay? He's very famous for his mousetrap experiment.
Yes.
If you take out any one of the component parts of the mousetrap, whether it's the spring or the latch or the wooden platform,
or
anything
the cheese or anything,
it
will no longer catch mice.
It no longer works.
Right.
Now, the point is that every piece of a living organism is pre-programmed in advance to a functional endpoint. And if you take away any little bit of that piece, then it's not going to be functional and it's not going to exist, or at least it's not going to be...
It won't survive.
Correct. In fact, if you do laser experiments where, let's say you have this organism reproducing itself in the laboratory, even if it's a tiny worm of 1,000 cells, or an amoeba or something like that, and as it's dividing, you zap it with a laser in certain spots, one of two things happens. You either have a lethal event, in which case the one that's dividing is dead and no longer goes on,
right,
or it's terribly mutated and non-functional.
Right.
Let's say it can't swim or it can't propel itself, across the microscope slide.
Right.
But something terrible happens to it if you interrupt the flow of genetic information.
Right.
So we do know now that things are irreducibly complex, and so it's just a different way of arguing that you can't go from a single-celled organism to something that's very complex, like a living organ, like your liver is a very complicated organ.
Right.
These processes...
Or the brain, or the eye, or any one of dozens of different components.
Darwin spent a number of pages in his book talking about how complicated the eye was and how it might be one of the downfalls of his own argument.
Right.
But the eyeball is very complex. You take away one component part of the eyeball and you go blind.
Right.
Okay?
Doesn't work anymore.
Doesn't work. So
and thank God that we can't give our adaptive things that happen to us to our children. Like, for instance, if you were in an accident and lost your leg, thank God that your son wouldn't be born with that leg missing.
Right.
You don't pass on characteristics like that happen to you in a single lifetime.
Right. Now, I said Michael Behe's book. I don't think I named the book by name. It's Darwin's Black Box.
Right.
So, but it's a tremendous book, and I would recommend any of you who have a scientific mind to look at it. It's not terribly complicated. If you have a high school education and you had some physics and biology and so forth, it's a read that you'll be able to manage.
And he's making the analogy with the black box, with the little black box that we have in airplanes that keeps records of what's happened to the airplane. He's saying that the modern science of microbiology has grown so much since Darwin's day that we have all this information about how we operate on a cellular basis is like the black box to Darwin that he wasn't aware of existed when he came up with his theory of evolution.
Yes,
but we have since learned all of this.
In the last 160 years, the complex array of life and all the machinery that governs life, whether it's DNA or RNA, messenger RNA, the ribosomes, the whole myriad of protein synthesis within the cell, and the fact that the entire genetic copy of your DNA resides in each and every cell of your body is just phenomenal.
There's a whole universe in microbiology that until relatively recently we were totally unaware of.
Right. And
Darwin was totally unaware of.
And the other thing, Kirk, and a lot of people don't realize this, is that evolutionists have never, ever been able to explain sexual reproduction.
Yeah, that is a tricky one.
Now,
I've always wondered myself, how did both the sexes evolve at the same time in order to make this system work?
Correct. And at what level did they start sharing their individual sets of DNA? In other words, sexual reproduction. When did that start?
If evolution was true, it would seem to me that everything would reproduce asexually, like some simple organisms do. That would make sense from an evolution viewpoint. Right.
And the last point that I wanted to drive home, and I'm going to frame it in this context. When my son was in 9th grade, he was in a debate in his science class. One group took the stance of intelligent design or creationism, and the other group took the stance of science, and Darwinism,
That must have been interesting.
It was, and it was judged. And my son, in preparation for this, he said, "Dad, give me what you think are your strongest arguments for intelligent design or creationism."
Right.
And I basically talked to him about spontaneous generation.
Right.
I talked to him about the second law of thermodynamics and entropy.
Right.
We talked about the law of biogenesis. These are all the things that we've talked about thus far.
Right.
We talked about irreducible complexity.
Right.
And the last thing I talked to him about was homochirality. Now, that's a tough molecular science word, but I'm going to explain it to you in this way.
Please do.
If you have a solution of, let's say, amino acids, you have both right-handed configurations and left-handed configurations that are identical, except that they're mirror images of one another.
Right.
One is a right-handed form, the other one is a left-handed form. Just like if you hold your two hands out with your two pinkies touching each other, and your thumbs are pointing away from each other, you've got a right-handed configuration, a left-handed configuration.
Right. A mirror image.
Mirror image, So you can have mirror images of amino acids, and it's interesting because the 21 or so amino acids that we see in life are all right-handed, not left-handed. So if you
all of them.
If you had a primordial soup of amino acids, which ones would come together and make a human being or any other animal for that matter? They would be right-handed amino acids. Not left-handed, not a mix. So chiral solutions, both right and left-handed in life, you get right-handed amino acids only. Now, likewise, if you look at DNA, all of the sugar backbones in the DNA molecule, are left-handed, Not right-handed, but left-handed.
All of them.
All of them. So this speaks very, very hard against...
That doesn't sound random, does it?
No, it doesn't. Folks, you've been listening to Evidence for Faith, and we've just given you some good thought for the evidences for intelligent design. Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis, and with me is Kirk Hastings. Join us again for next week, and remember, the best reason for being a Christian is because it's true.